You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia. This is our weekly link-up with our bureaus in London, Washington, D.C. and Moscow. My name is Brendan Cole, and today is May Day. And for those who still believe in working-class solidarity, it's a celebration of hard-won rights in the workplace. It's also known as International Workers' Day and has its roots in America, commemorating as it does what is known as the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago in 1886. That was when several demonstrators at a rally for an 8-hour workday were killed. May the 1st was subsequently chosen as the date for International Workers' Day by the Socialists and Communists of the Second International in 1891. Ironically, May Day is no longer a public holiday in the US, as it was considered too radical at the height of the Cold War, and the American Federation of Labor itself wanted distance from it. But it still remains an important official holiday in several countries, including China, Cuba and Russia, and is marked all around the world. Earlier today, a May Day rally on Red Square in Moscow drew an estimated 100,000 people in the largest such demonstration since Soviet times, and Labour organisers said that a total of 2 million people had attended similar rallies around the country. This year, Indonesia will mark its first Labour Day national holiday, and in London today, thousands of activists attended a May Day rally to pay tribute, among other things, to the rail union leader Bob Crow and the Labour left-winger Tony Benn, both of whom died within a few days of each other back in March. But what about May Day? Is it a day of diminishing significance, or could it rise again? The international socialist movement was a considerable force, and their causes in the 20th century were many. But has it been replaced by something? What is this? And what can a group of a left-leaning persuasion support today? Can International Workers' Day mean something again? And what of solidarity itself? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Lindsay German. She's the convener of the British anti-war organisation Stop the War Coalition. She's also a former member of the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party and was editor of Socialist Review for 20 years until 2004. We'll also be joined by our guests in Washington, D.C. That's Francis Boyle, professor at the Illinois College of Law and author of the book Talking America's Toughest Questions. Also in Moscow, our political commentator at the Voice of Russia, Dmitry Babich, and Hilary Wainwright will also be joining us here in the London studio. She's the founding editor of Red Pepper magazine. Well, Lindsay, welcome. First of all, I mean, you've just come from a May Day commemoration in London. What was the kind of mood there, and what were people really commemorating in your view?
Well, the mood was very good. It was partly that they were commemorating Tony Benn, who, as you say, was a veteran left-winger who died in March, Bob Crow, the leader of the Rail Workers Union, who died in the same week. So there were many rail workers turned out, many other trade unions, but also anti-war and peace activists, all sorts of campaigners who wanted to be there to show their solidarity. And I think that what lots of people feel is in Britain at the moment, we're desperately in need of some of the things that May Day stands for. It was set up in the 19th century to deal with long hours that people had to work, with bullying employers and bosses, with people not having any health and safety at work. And now in the 21st century, we're still faced with the same problems.
Now, you've written a book called The People's History of London, and you outline what previous May Day commemorations were like. How did they compare in the past? Were they bigger?
Well,
what's different now?
What they started off as is quite small. But then in 1889 in London, there were huge strike movements, particularly the dockers, but also the gas workers. And then the following year, they had a huge demonstration on May Day in Hyde Park. And Frederick Engels, who was Karl Marx's close collaborator, spoke on one of the platforms at this May Day in 1890, and he said that I'd stepped off the platform with the spring in my step because I saw the grandchildren of the Chartists were coming back into action again. So I think this is a generational thing as well, that people face problems. They sometimes campaign but don't succeed in winning their demands, but then new generations find new ways of doing it.
So, but a relatively small commemoration here in London, does that give you concern, or do you think it's something that can bounce back?
I think that in Britain there isn't the tradition that there is in many countries, including in France and Italy, of celebrating May Day. And of course it isn't a holiday. Although we have a May Day holiday, it's always on the Monday. So this year it's on the 5th of May rather than on the 1st. So this isn't actually a holiday for people. If it were a holiday, we would have considerable bigger numbers. But it's true, it's not the biggest march anywhere in the world. I do think, though, that it's becoming more important and that people are seeing more relevance for trade unions again.
It is a public holiday in Russia, and we'll join our guest in Moscow, Dmitry Babich. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken to rally, and they feel that it's a significant moment and something worth commemorating in Moscow and throughout Russia. Isn't that right, Dmitry?
Well, I think it was a mixed crowd today on the Red Square. Some of these people just came because they're loyal to the state, and in a way it looked like an official celebration of Soviet times. But there were also some true leftist activists who are concerned about not just the situation of workers in Russia, but, for example, there's a lot of concern about the protests in the east of Ukraine. You know, in the Western media, these protests are usually presented as just some work of undercover Russian activists or Russian special services. And the real picture is a lot more complicated. It's not just about, Russian speakers versus Ukrainian speakers. Also, don't forget that the eastern Ukraine was the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union. There are lots of coal mines, a lot of steel mills. Now a lot of people there are without jobs. And their protest is not just against the nationalists who took power in Kiev, it's also against a very uneven distribution of wealth in society, and it's against the general ideology of the new government, which often presents these people as remnants of the Soviet Union, which are economically not viable. And unfortunately, indeed, in the east of Ukraine, the regions which used to be the motors of the country's economic development, like Donbass, which is the main coal mining region in the former Soviet Union, now they operate at a loss. So it reminds me of the situation in the UK in the 80s, when suddenly mines became unprofitable and people had to change their lifestyles. Millions of people had to change their lifestyles because of that.
I'll join our guest in Washington, D.C., Francis Boyle, professor at the Illinois College of Law. Welcome to the Voice of Russia. Francis, I mean, the roots of May Day are actually in America. I'm just wondering, that kind of division or that discrepancy between the rich and the poor that Dmitry is talking about is one that's very alive in America, but does it agitate Americans? I mean, is May Day a big deal there?
Well, actually, I was born in Chicago, lived the first 21 years of my life, have been out to the memorial site for the Haymarket massacre. So we know all about it. I come from a union family. My granduncle, Michael Boyle, founded the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers in Chicago around the turn of the last century. Mike repeatedly turned out all the lights in the city of Chicago to set up this union. And as a result of these efforts, he was persecuted by the Taft administration, a very conservative Republican administration after Teddy Roosevelt and before President Wilson. He was convicted in a kangaroo court proceeding. The U.S. Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, which, by the way, were licensed to practice law, called Mike, quote, a leech on commerce, unquote. And that he was to set up his union. He was put in prison for several years. And finally, when President Wilson was elected, he was pardoned. But he's still vilified today here in America. They recently produced a biography accusing him of being a member of organized crime. But if you read the book very carefully, there's no evidence that he was. He was just a labor leader and a union founder. So unfortunately, we've seen massive attacks on organized labor here in the United States that is still going on today as we speak. I myself was a leader in our professors union here, American Federation of Teachers, for 3 years on our executive committee, and also on the Champaign County AFL-CIO board. Very difficult for organized labor here in the United States, and that's why the holiday was shifted from May Day, commemorating the Haymarket Massacre, to Labor Day, to discourage an association with labor activism. So it's very tough for labor here in the United States. Unions are under attack everywhere. The teachers' unions are under assault. It's very tough.
And I mean, Lindsay, the outline of the United States situation, the American situation about unionized labor seems to be, well, unions do seem to be very weak. Do you think that Britain is heading in that direction?
Well, I think the unions here are much weaker than they used to be. There's no question about that. They're about half the size. The density is much less than it was in the late 70s. And they're subject to assault by the government and by the employers. But there are all sorts of signs that people don't want this to happen. If you look at the opinion polls, you find that many of the things that the unions campaign for, in terms of fairness at work, in terms of jobs for young people, in terms of public ownership rather than privatisation, in defence of the NHS, these are all quite popular things. So it's a question of whether the unions can relate to new generations of workers. This is what the teachers' union is trying to do, for example. They've had a number of strikes. The tube workers in London have had successful strikes, including this week. They had a 2-day strike, which was quite successful. So there is an attack on the unions, but people are trying to do something about it. And the truth is that what has happened in the world, in Britain and the United States, is that the share of wealth that now goes to labour, in other words, that now goes to working people, is lower than it has been for, 100 years. So people are suffering much greater inequality, and I think this will lead people back to the unions.
But in terms of the inequality question, I mean, a party that your organisation would probably associate itself with historically, the Labour Party, has changed irrevocably over the last generation. Do you still see yourself as allied with the Labour Party, or then the new Labour Party, accepting, of course, that Labour has a new leader with a Marxist background, some would say?
I'm very, very critical of New Labour. I think that it's a party which is a warmongering party. It's a party which has done very little for the working people who represent it. Probably most of us will end up voting Labour next year because the alternative will be the Tories or UKIP or one of the right-wing parties. But the truth is it doesn't speak for working people, and it was set up 100 years ago to speak for working people, and many people now think we will have to get a new and more left-wing alternative if we're going to have a real workers' party, if you like.
Dmitry Babich, in Moscow, I mean, the socialist movement was a considerable movement and a considerable antidote, I suppose, to capitalism, at least until the end of the Cold War. The protests of 1968, they protested against many different things. That's on the wane, though, isn't it? I mean, who do left-wingers now support?
Well, Russia is a special case because under the Soviet Union we had a government which proclaimed itself to be leftist, but which I think was leftist only maybe until the late 20s, and it had never been democratic between 1917 and 1991, unfortunately. But right now the labor movement in Russia is, it may not be very strong and it's not very visible, but it exists. And I think it's underreported because, for example, from the Western media you may get an impression that strikes are forbidden in Russia and that there are no strikes in Russia. This is not true. If you go to the sites of the labor movement, for example, rabcore.ru, you will see that strikes happen here almost every week. And there are whole regions which have, I would say, some striking enterprises, striking communities, I would say. But unfortunately, these activities are underreported. The state media is not interested to report them for obvious reasons. And the liberal media is, I think it's just afraid of the labor movement. The liberal media creates an impression that you can make things right in Russia just by removing President Putin from power and replacing him with some liberal activist, probably someone supported by the West. So I think that basically the labor movement in Russia is on the rise, and in future we're going to have more of it. But right now it's sort of cut off from the media. The state media is not interested in reporting on labor movement for obvious reasons, and liberals have a disproportionately big access to the opposition media. Opposition media is not interested enough, I would say, in labor movement in Russia.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole.
This is Radio VR, the voice of Russia, coming to you live from London.
Hilary Wainwright, you're the founding editor of Red Pepper magazine, and you're a political activist as well. And on May Day, there were thousands of people that commemorated May Day in London. But in terms of the global socialist movement, do you think it's been adequately replaced? At least some would say that its influence is on the wane, but there are still global Occupy movements. There's still anti-globalists, but they're very different organizations or outfits than their socialist predecessors, some would argue.
Yes, that they are very different, but I think what is still very strong and growing in a way is both a critique and a rejection of capitalism. I mean, you mentioned Occupy, and even though that began quite small, it had an incredible impact, really putting problems of inequality on the agenda in a way in which sometimes the sort of traditional left of the past wasn't always able to do. And I think that there is a kind of growing, I mean, you see it also in this latest book by Tom Piketty, there's an intellectual critique that's growing of inequality, of the incapacity of capitalism to meet the needs of the mass of people. And then there's a practical critique. And at the same time, there's a kind of search for the appropriate alternative, the forms of socialism that can really be responsive to people's needs, that can really be democratic. So there's a lot of learning going on from the failures of the past. Nobody, I'm sure Lindsay would agree, nobody would be wanting to say socialism equals the Soviet Union. We became socialists against both sort of the capitalist West and the kind of command economy East. And in our practice, as well as theoretically, we're always experimenting with alternatives. I worked, for example, for the Greater London Council under Ken Livingstone. And that wasn't like a finished model of socialism. It was a constant experiment, which was, in the end, extremely popular. And you look at Tony Benn, incredibly popular, because he was articulating the idea that there must be an alternative, and the capacities for that alternative lay with the mass of ordinary people.
And Tony Benn commemorated today, as well as Bob Crow, who died within a few days of each other a couple of months ago. So two significant stalwarts of the left being remembered today on this day. But in terms of the point about capitalism and, say, a strong, opponent to capitalism, people are disenchanted with capitalism in terms of the way the media reports, say, bankers' bonuses, or the gap between the rich and the poor, or the rich getting richer. So there is an appetite, isn't there, at least within the United Kingdom, of an alternative to capitalism? I
think there is, and it's noticeable that when Ed Miliband was kind of on the offensive against particular aspects of capitalism, the ways in which the energy companies are kind of ripping people off, and he laid into them, he was very popular. And so there is this appetite. The problem has been there isn't been adequate voices. I mean, I think Occupy, its impact illustrates that, because, in a way, they managed to sort of express this feeling, this appetite. And now we'd like to see, more politicians doing the same. But in the absence of that, there'll continue to be initiatives from just ordinary people, whether it's unions fighting privatisation, putting forward an alternative vision of the public sector as responsive to public needs, or people experimenting with cooperatives, with all kinds of social, socialism, we've got to focus on the social versus the individual. It's not about the state, although it involves a different kind of state, but it's about forms of mutuality, forms of social and collaborative. I mean, I mustn't go on, but, I think the other thing is, if we think about the new generation, at the heart of the new technology is the whole idea of sharing. If you think about open software, peer-to-peer forms of sharing, that's kind of in daily life. And, I'm a bit ancient now, but my nieces and nephews, their way of they in a way try and practice a way of life that's more socialistic than certainly in my youth.
What about in the US, Francis Boyle? I mean, you mentioned how unions are under siege and workers are under siege in the United States, very much so. But America really is the home of the market economy, and that's really unlikely to change, isn't it?
I don't know. It's certainly the case that since the Reagan administration came to power in 1981, we've seen a war against unions and against organized labor, typified by Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers. And it's been all downhill since then. I don't know what to say, and it's escalating, and the class warfare is getting worse. The inequality of wealth here in America, we have the highest rate of impacted wealth in the entire developed world. I simply do not know how long working class people here in America can take it. The problem is, I regret to say, having been a union leader myself for 3 years, that the leaders of the big unions are part of the establishment now. They're not like my granduncle Mike Boyle, who went to jail in order to set his union up. If there's a strike these days, the bosses go to court, the judges issue an order saying you have to end the strike, and the bosses say, well, we have to end the strike. Well, I mean, that's preposterous. Of course, the judges are part of the bosses too. So there's no real leadership these days for organized labor to take on the class warfare that is going on. Occupy Wall Street was an encouraging sign. I supported them. I gave interviews for them, but the media was all against them. Indeed, the media here in America is part of big business, so they are anti-labor. You turn on anything on any mainstream news media here in the United States, written or in airwaves, and everything is anti-labor.
And also,
but
Francis,
giving an interview to.
Forgive me for interrupting, but Francis, isn't it also the way the media treats? Well, it was interesting on this side of the pond hearing how the American media treated, say, Obamacare, providing health care to people in the United States that were unable to get health care, and this word socialist was almost spat out as an insult, and this was a socialist system. So the media certainly weren't helping there. Perhaps there's a kind of something ingrained in the American psyche that has an antipathy towards this kind of collective ideal where everybody can be helped.
Well, in fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides that health care is a basic human right. And that Universal Declaration went back to President Franklin Roosevelt and his four freedoms, and his wife, Eleanor, was involved in that declaration. But today we see a massive assault even on the New Deal. An attempt to deconstruct even Social Security and the other gains for labor and common people made here in America under the Roosevelt administration. And it does not appear that organized labor, unions or other, are providing the leadership to fight back. They're part of the problem, I regret to say, and not part of the solution. The Occupy movement was a good sign, but and again, I did support them, but it seemed to be somewhat more anarchistic than organized. Not, they had no leadership. Nothing came of it. I have nothing against anarchism. I just lectured on Kropotkin to my jurisprudence students, but you have to get organized, and I don't believe that's something they really understood.
Actually, I'll put that to Lindsay German quickly before I go back to Dmitry Babich in Moscow. That is interesting, isn't it? I mean, that Occupy movement is not really seen as a viable alternative for many in the mainstream of British political life. And I'm wondering whether they are adequate representatives of of people who do feel that there needs to be some kind of antidote to capitalism.
Well, I think the Occupy movement was very, very important in that it asked a lot of very good questions and it presented an alternative way of doing things. I don't think it actually has succeeded in bringing about fundamental change, but we could make the same point about a whole number of other campaigns. I think the important thing here is not whether the unions or Occupy or any of the different campaigns are able to have succeeded. I mean, it's absolutely clear that if you look at the unions in all the major countries have been weakened in the last 20 or 30 years by neoliberalism. It's really a question, if the conditions are such that people are facing greater inequality, they're facing attacks on welfare, they're facing attacks on their education, on a very, very wide range, we could list hundreds of things where people feel there's a grievance. The real question is, will people begin to develop organisation? Because that is how Labour was developed. It was how the trade unions were developed. They didn't start fully fledged. They were people campaigning for justice, campaigning for equality, campaigning for the 8-hour day, all these sorts of issues. And they formed organisations out of this. And that, to me, is the hope. I think there's very much the objective conditions where people will campaign. But it's true that the old unions and the old ways of doing things have certainly got to change if they're going to relate to those movements.
Dmitry Babich, I mean, Russia does have a big disparity between rich and poor. I mean, would people feel exercised to join unions, to agitate against that?
Well, I would say that problems are largely the same now, not only in Russia, but also in all of the former Soviet Union and in the West. There is a very little participation in labor unions. Basically, it's not because the unions are prohibited or because police would arrest you for joining a union. That's not true. But people are led to believe by advertising, by the mass media, that they don't need to fight for their labor rights, that if only they could get a little more money and buy a new mobile phone, they would be so much happier. And also, if we take, for example, our version of Occupy movements, they are not usually labor protests. I mean, in Ukraine, for example, this Maidan protest was not about trashing capitalism. It was about just replacing one government with another. And most of the rhetoric at these protests was nationalist. I mean, this is one of the traps that people are led into by modern propaganda. Instead of facing the real issue and trashing capitalism, people are led to blame some migrants or minorities inside their own country. In Ukraine, people were led to believe that their problems are because of the Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine. You know, these Russian speakers, who are also Ukrainian citizens, they were treated by the nationalist press in Ukraine as almost subhumans. And a lot of people during the Maidan protests indeed believed this propaganda. So I think that the main problem is that modern society has, it's very easy to lead it astray. People are really led to believe that they don't have to fight for their labor rights. They just need to earn more money, or they need to change the government, or they need to remove this or other ethnic minority. And this is, of course, a dead end, because you will not really solve the problems in this way.
Okay, Hilary Wainwright, you've written that the British labour movement of the 1980s cannot be recreated because of the fragmented working class. What do you mean by that? Do you mean that, would you say that the working class is fragmented globally as well?
Yes, I mean, what I mean by that is that the consequences of the ways in which corporate and capitalist organisations have developed has been to fragment, to divide. I mean, if you think about subcontracting, whether it's in the public sector or in corporations, you know, that sort of fragmented and isolated groups of workers into small companies, often not connected to the unions, because it's much more difficult to organise at that kind of very diffuse level. And although unions are now increasingly trying, it's been very difficult. So there's been a change in the organisation of work into much smaller, fragmented workplaces. And I think that the labour movement of the 80s, its habits of organisation, its traditions were very much to do with the mass workplace. But that isn't the only kind of resource and capacity in the history of the labour movement. You know, as Lindsay was implying, there's been a lot of history at the very beginning. If you think about the match girls and the all the different groups of women, particularly that were organised at the very beginning of the labour movement, it was women that were they were doing outsourced work, doing homework. And the union was able to organise them. It took more imagination. It took a conception of trade unionism as not just being about the workplace in the traditional sense, but about sort of daily life. But, for example, just the other day we heard that tragedy of the Avalon.
And the American Federation of Labour itself wanted distance from it. But it still remains an important official holiday in several countries, including China, Cuba and Russia, and is marked all around the world. Earlier today, a May Day rally on Red Square in Moscow drew an estimated 100,000 people in the largest such demonstration since Soviet times. And Labour organisers said that a total of 2 million people had attended similar rallies around the country. This year, Indonesia will mark its first Labour Day national holiday. And in London today, thousands of activists attended a May Day rally to pay tribute, among other things, to the rail union leader Bob Crow and the Labour left-winger Tony Benn. Both. You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia. This is our weekly link-up with our bureaus in London, Washington, D.C., and Moscow. My name is Brendan Cole, and today is May Day. And for those who still believe in working-class solidarity, it's a celebration of hard-won rights in the workplace. It's also known as International Workers' Day and has its roots in America, commemorating as it does what is known as the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago in 1886. That was when several demonstrators at a rally for an 8-hour workday were killed. May the 1st was subsequently chosen as the date for International Workers' Day by the Socialists and Communists of the Second International in 1891. Ironically, May Day is no longer a public holiday in the US, as it was considered too radical at the height of the Cold War. We'll be joined by our guests in Washington, D.C. That's Francis Boyle, professor at the Illinois College of Law and author of the book Talking America's Toughest Questions. Also in Moscow, our political commentator at the Voice of Russia, Dmitry Babich. And Hilary Wainwright will also be joining us here in the London studio. She's the founding editor of Red Pepper magazine. Well, Lindsay, welcome. First of all, you've just come from a May Day commemoration in London. What was the kind of mood there, and what were people really commemorating in your view?
Well, the mood was very good. It was partly that they were commemorating Tony Benn, who, as you say, was a veteran left-winger who died in March, Bob Crow, the leader of the Rail Workers Union, who died in the same week. So there were many rail workers turned out, many other trade unions, but also anti-war and peace activists, all sorts of campaigners who wanted to be there to show their solidarity. And I think that what lots of people feel is in Britain at the moment, we're desperately in need of some of the things that May Day stands for. It was set up in the 19th century to deal with long hours that people had to work, with bullying employers and bosses, with people not having any health and safety at work. And now in the 21st century, we're still faced with this.
Of whom died within a few days of each other back in March. But what about May Day? Is it a day of diminishing significance, or could it rise again? The international socialist movement was a considerable force, and their causes in the 20th century were many. But has it been replaced by something? What is this? And what can a group of a left-leaning persuasion support today? Can International Workers' Day mean something again? And what of solidarity itself? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined in the studio by Lindsay German. She's the convener of the British anti-war organisation Stop the War Coalition. She's also a former member of the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party and was editor of Socialist Review for 20 years until 2004. We'll also